Hey guys, coming to you from DC today with the Biden administration announcing the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Discretionary Grant Program. We're looking at about $2.5 billion being set aside to push towards electric vehicle charging. And I wanted to take this opportunity to talk a bit about why I think it's actually by far the most important part of the EV adoption story, and make a little bit of a connection to China as well. You guys know, as a China studies guy, I always have to do that. So the CFI discretionary grant program, again, is about $2.5 billion to roll out over 5 years to basically build out America's charging infrastructure. I think the plan proposes something like 500,000 chargers by 2030. And I think in some ways this shows a lot of foresight from the administration, because I think it's become clear that we're at the point or very near it where EV adoption or lack of adoption really is no longer limited primarily by battery capacity, but in fact is limited most obviously by battery charging speed. When you've got, say, the top 3 to 5 EVs in sales volume in the United States, I think the lowest range on any of those vehicles is probably the Chevy Bolt at about 250 miles of range. Well, for most people, that's more than sufficient, right? Outside of the odd road trip that we might take. But when you start looking at some of the new vehicles with the 800 volt architecture on the Kias and the Porsches of the world, this is really what the game changer is, because even on these road trips, which we don't take as often as we like to admit that we do, right? These are pretty rare occurrences. This 800 volt architecture really means you can get in and out, basically from 20 to 80 in 15, 18, 20 minutes, something like that. And again, as much as we don't want to admit it, on a longer road trip, if you're going to drive 200 miles or so, you're going to be out of the car for 10 or 15 minutes to stretch your legs and use the restroom, get a cup of coffee, walk the dog, whatever it might be, right? So we're starting to get into territory on these 800 volt systems where this is totally compatible with how people, outside of a, very specific commercial context, this is how people drive, right? So it's been clear for a while now. I mean, unless you're driving a boat, a recreational boat from, a lake in Wyoming to a lake in Utah, and you need to tow that thing, and you're doing that on a regular basis, many times a year, really EVs are going to be the solution for you. They're just going to be superior in almost every drivetrain aspect, in every reliability aspect, in every performance aspect, in every livability aspect to an ICE vehicle. And really this use case that kind of breaks EVs, right? This sort of long-range towing use case, or these long-range road trip use cases. These are also things that are quite limited to an American context, right? In Europe and Asia, the battery ranges are already sufficient. I mean, I remember watching a fully charged episode where they were testing, I think it was a Mustang Mach-E, and they had to take it from somewhere in the North Country all the way down to Cornwall, and back over to Sussex, and then to Ireland, and then Northern Ireland, and then they had to actually go out of their way to get enough travel to make this work, right? Or you look at people who live in urban areas in Asia, the adoption there is already happening. You look at people who live in smaller countries like Norway or Sweden, the adoption in some of these countries is 80%, right? Because these platforms are just so superior to a nice platform. Another great point that people like Adam Something will make here on YouTube is another advantage that Europe and Asia have over the United States is they have something called trains. He often jokes about how a lot of technology, novel technology, or what promises to be novel technology, just ends up accidentally reinventing the train, right? So for longer range trips, right, this is where somebody who lives in Germany or China would say, well, I'm probably not going to drive that 400 miles. That sounds kind of like a pain in the butt. I'm going to get on a train and sleep, and then get there refreshed, and not have to park my car in a weird city that I've never been to. And so why am I talking about this? I mean, this all basically means that as time progresses, that we're already talking about in a lot of these vehicles, these upper end vehicles, the Teslas, the Mustang Mach-E's, certainly the Rivians of the world. These are all vehicles that are, at or around 300 miles of range or more. Your Porsche Taycans, your Kia EV6s. All these vehicles have sufficient range for most places on Earth. They don't necessarily for the United States, or at least we like to think that they don't, even though our daily driving is probably under 40 miles a day. But what this means is there's going to be decreasing pressure from the market to continue to expand the range of these batteries, because there's just not that many places on Earth where people drive that far. And this is further complicated by the fact that you're still a human being. You still have to get out of the car every 3 hours, right? So in some ways, the manufacturers and many of the consumers of these vehicles around the world already are going to start to see this problem as functionally solved, right? Even if you don't have 600 miles in a battery, you functionally do, because you can recharge it. You can get another 100 miles in 5 minutes, or you can get, almost back to 85% in say 20 minutes, right? So as time goes on, these incentives mean that the progress in battery technology and range technology, this is really going to shift more and more towards efficiency gains, through the system, and charging efficiency gains, right? And really where you'll see the changes in batteries, I predict, will be around this kind of capacity to charge more quickly. Because functionally this ends up kind of being the same, right? But you get to keep the weight of the car down. I'm sure battery storage technology will continue to progress at pace, but I think it's not a bold assumption to say we will see wild, massive improvements in charging technology occur before, solid state, sexy solid state batteries or anything like that. That's not a bold assumption or a bold prediction, because that's already true, right? We already have an architecture that allows for such rapid charging that really you're almost on par with a gasoline engine to begin with, and that's here now, whereas solid state batteries in an industrial context aren't. The progress will be around this charging speed, and then the progress you'll see with batteries, and this is really what's going to drive the sort of J-curve adoption and the rapid, I think, obsolescence of ICE vehicles. Will be that these batteries, the costs for the batteries that we do have in the 250 to 400 mile ranges are going to just completely plummet, right? Because there's going to be increased competition, increased access to lithium and other key materials, increased recycling, efficiency gains in that process. This is all to say that I'm on board with everybody who's waiting for the super sexy solid state batteries to revolutionize everything, and we have 700 miles of range, and this is all, I'm sure eventually we'll get there, right? But what's going to drive adoption in the short term is charging infrastructure, because that's actually where we're at now in terms of making these things livable, right? To live with these vehicles will really come down to having a charging infrastructure that frankly is even closely approximating the refueling infrastructure that we have for ICE vehicles. And so this is why I think it's a problem, and why I wanted to make this tie into China, that a province like Guangdong province, with, I think it has a population of 126 million people, right? America, United States of America has 350 million people. Guangdong has more public charging infrastructure than the entire country of the United States of America. Guangdong is the most well accommodated province in China, but I think it has over 370,000 public chargers compared to 113 or so in the United States. That CFI discretionary grant program I mentioned earlier from the Biden administration, remember when I said 500,000 public chargers by 2030? That sounds all well and good until you realize that that's what China's adding every year now. So our national goal, which obviously is speculative and there's a lot of resistance to outlaying that money, is already being eclipsed on a yearly basis by China, at least, if we trust their statistics, which, let's be real here. I'm as critical of Chinese statistics as anybody, but there are indications that these numbers are at least not completely fudged. I mean, you do see reports that a lot of these public chargers in China are quite slow, or that they're not available, or that they're for fleets only. But, there are reports out of, joint ventures, like there's a Sino German company called T-Good, and this is one of the bigger players in the Chinese domestic charging market. And I think that they had said recently they had 170 some thousand chargers in China. And so that's one company, right, with basically more chargers than the United States has. And this is a company that's at least somewhat open to external auditing. Presumably. We'll take the Chinese numbers with a grain of salt, but I think it's fair to assume that they're outpacing us in the United States quite rapidly. So, I hope now we can kind of see why this is a concern, why chargers, I think, are at the core of the story of EV adoption and having a competitive EV sector and EV industry. But we can also see the problem here, right, in that we are losing rapidly to our really primary geostrategic competitor in this space, and the space is one that's critical to this emerging technology. So how do we solve this? How do we begin to move towards remediating this this disparity or eliminating this disparity, because obviously this kind of infrastructure build out is really well suited to the Chinese system and the Chinese political economy. These kinds of really capital intensive upfront infrastructure investments are things that they really excel at, and frankly things that we don't in our sort of deliberative open system. Where stakeholders, local stakeholders especially, are quite empowered to resist development. A couple of key lessons stand out for us. Let's say that's 3 lessons that we have from the Chinese EV charging case study. The first is actually a lesson we can learn from the People's Republic of China and most of the European Union, in that you need one charger, bottom line. It's 2023, it's time to move forward in the United States with one plug for these vehicles. The second point to make is a little bit more nuanced, and this is that, similar to a lot of business ventures, when you're talking about EV chargers, public chargers, these are at the core, even in the Chinese context, right? These are businesses. They need to be utilized for some percentage of the day to be profitable and to be things that make a return on investment for the people that created them. This number for EV charging stations tends to be around 8 to 10% of the time in a day that these need to be utilized to be profitable. And early on, this is difficult, right? Because your charger may not show up on the map. You may get some bad reviews because of some kind of delivery problem or reliability problem, and then people avoid the station. It may not be in a perfect location. There's all kinds of reasons that this could happen. It may be on a new route. It may be in an area where, for whatever reason, in that locale, not many people have adopted EVs yet, and they've sort of been waiting to see chargers popping up to buy into this new technology. So what the Chinese do, I think, comparatively quite well, is they supply capital and they boost through loans and grants the profitability of these charging stations early on, right? They give them a boost early on, and then take the training wheels off as time progresses and more people find out about the charger, and the utilization rate goes up to that 8 to 10 to 12% where it can actually turn a profit. And obviously, like I said, the training wheels are removed and it's sort of floated, right, as a free enterprise. This is where we really fall flat in the United States, right? Because this is essentially, you could extend loans to these companies and over time probably, make money back, right? There's got to be a way to structure that as a speculative investment in a business, just like anything else, right? And I think the final lesson that we can take from the Chinese context is these charging stations that you're subsidizing for the first portion of their lifespan, co-locate them with electrified fleets, whether it's Hertz or the municipal bus system in the area, the postal system, the postal truck system. These are all ways to essentially group the electrification around these nodes, and then you're going to get really high utilization, right? Because you have fleet vehicles that are going to be used and going to have high utilization themselves, right? And what you see in this context is, if the buses in your municipality, some of the taxis and other sort of fare-based transportation, certainly rental cars, when these things become electrified, the rest of the public can almost be a free rider on top of that charging infrastructure. And this is where, as voters and taxpayers in the United States, we have to really emphasize, there really is no excuse in 2023 for the Postal Service to be rolling out vehicles that aren't electrified, right? There really is no excuse for new bus purchases in a municipality that aren't electrified. These high utilization, low trip length, high reliability needed vehicles. I mean, these are essentially completely perfect for EV drivetrains and will save the taxpayers money over the long term, with the advantage of adding charging infrastructure that's desperately needed. And so this is deeply unsexy stuff, right? But this is where in your local community, it's incredibly important to emphasize, why are we making any investments in technologies, even if your local representatives don't care at all about the environment. They definitely care about the tax base and the efficiency of the municipal investments, right? So these are the kind of technologies that just have to transition to electrification, and the consequent expansion of the charging infrastructure is really what's going to help expand public access. These public charging stations, and obviously commercial or municipal charging stations, oftentimes even in China, these are different things, but you have to remember that the contractors and the engineers and the companies, all the infrastructure that's there to support building out a giant charging bay for a bus system, even if that system isn't explicitly shared with the public. It could be adjacent to a public charger. It could be part of a package of a suite of charging locations that are all in one, co-located in one spot. Even just the experience of having sourced, built, and installed these kinds of things can then be applied by those companies into other contexts within the same location or a nearby location. And so that's kind of it for me today. I think it's just important to emphasize and again kind of tell you what I told you. I think the future of electrification is the future of EVs is obviously in the charging accessibility and charging speeds. I think it's quite clear that China is leading not only in the United States but the world in installing these kinds of chargers and upping these charging speeds, and probably really the Koreans and the Kias and the Hyundais of the world, and to a lesser extent the Volkswagen group with Porsche are also doing this through the 800 volt architecture. And this is really what you need to be looking for when you're buying an EV, but also what we're going to be looking for going forward as to what makes this technology viable. And we also want to emphasize, right, that there's essentially three key lessons we can take away about how to improve charging infrastructure to make adoption happen more quickly. And this would be really a shared charging infrastructure, early subsidization of chargers, and then obviously co-locating sort of fleet and municipal chargers with public chargers. This is what's really going to allow us to get outside of this range anxiety, especially with the emergence of these fast 800 volt architectures. So thanks as always for watching. It's a topic I'm really passionate about, and I am excited to read your comments below.